Do you remember when a Hollywood affair could genuinely bring down a marriage, a career, or an entire studio's box office numbers overnight? In the 1960s and 70s, some of the most famous women in the world found themselves accused in newspapers and gossip columns of walking off with another woman's husband. Some of these stories ended in decades of genuine happiness. Others ended in heartbreak and public humiliation that followed the people involved for the rest of their lives. Stick around, because number one on this list is a scandal so enormous it happened not once, but twice, to the very same woman. Number 10. Suzanne Summers. Before she became a household name on television, Suzanne Summers was working as a prize model on a modest game show called The Anniversary Game, hosted by a charming Canadian broadcaster named Alan Hamill. The two met in 1969, and there was an immediate and undeniable spark between them. Summers later described the connection as instant, recalling that she felt drawn to him the moment they started talking, long before either of them had any real sense of where the relationship might eventually lead. And she would later joke openly in interviews about just how quickly things between them turned physical on that very first night together. There was just one complication. Hamill was already married to his first wife, Marilyn, with whom he had two children, and by all accounts, a stable, established family life that gave no outward sign of trouble. Despite that, Summers and Hamill began seeing each other, and their relationship continued even as Hamill's marriage unraveled around it. He and Marilyn divorced in 1971, but Summers and Hamill didn't rush to the altar themselves, choosing instead to date for nearly a decade before finally marrying in 1977, a lengthy courtship that gave both of them time to establish their own individual careers before formally blending their lives together. During those years together before marriage, the couple worked to blend their respective families, with Summers bringing her own young son from a previous marriage into the mix alongside Hamill's two children from his first marriage. What started as a complicated, scandal-tinged beginning eventually grew into one of the most famously devoted marriages in all of show business, lasting until Summers's death in 2023, more than 50 years after they first met on that game show set. It's a rare example on this list of a relationship that began under a cloud of controversy, but somehow blossomed into genuine, lasting devotion, one that both Summers and Hamill spoke about warmly and openly for the rest of their lives together, describing themselves in later interviews as barely able to spend even a single day apart across more than 4 decades of marriage. But not every story on this list ended so warmly. The next celebrity built her entire romance on a movie set, alongside a legendary tough guy actor, and the wife she left behind carried the sting of that betrayal for the rest of her life. Number 9. Jill Ireland. In the early 1960s, English actress Jill Ireland was happily married to fellow actor David McCallum, best known at the time for his work on the hit series The Man from UNCLE. In 1962, McCallum co-starred alongside a rugged character actor named Charles Bronson in the war film The Great Escape, and Ireland occasionally visited the set to see her husband at work, a set that included a genuinely star-studded ensemble cast featuring the likes of Steve McQueen and James Garner alongside the two men. It was there that Bronson met Ireland for the first time, and according to accounts from those who knew him, he told McCallum directly and without hesitation that he intended to marry his wife one day, a declaration so bold that McCallum reportedly assumed at the time it was simply a joke, or at worst, a passing bit of macho bravado between two men working long hours on a demanding film set. At the time, the comment must have sounded almost absurd. Bronson was himself already married to his first wife, Harriet Tendler, with whom he had two children and a marriage that had been going since 1949, a union built on years of shared struggle during the early, uncertain days of both of their acting careers. But over the following years, exactly what Bronson had predicted came to pass. His marriage to Tendler ended in 1965, and Ireland's marriage to McCallum unravelled not long afterward, with the couple separating in 1965 and finalising their divorce in 1967. The following year, in October of 1968, Bronson and Ireland married, blending their combined 5 children into one large household and going on to have 2 more together. Adopted daughters they raised alongside the children from both of their previous marriages. The two went on to become one of the most prolific on-screen couples of the following 2 decades, appearing together in more than a dozen films throughout the 1970s and 80s, frequently collaborating both in front of and behind the camera, with Ireland even taking on producing credits for several of their later projects together. McCallum, for his part, later said publicly that he held no lasting resentment toward Bronson for how things unfolded, even decades later, describing the split as painful, but something he had ultimately made peace with over time, and the 2 men reportedly went on to maintain a cordial, if distant, relationship for the rest of their lives. It was, in its own strange way, one of the more amicable endings on this list, given just how dramatically and openly it had begun back on that film set in 1962. The next entry, however, involves a much younger woman, a much older director, and a betrayal that played out right on the film set where the affair began. Number 8. Sybil Shepherd. In 1970, a young model named Sybil Shepherd caught the eye of director Peter Bogdanovich in an unexpected way. According to widely reported accounts, it was actually Bogdanovich's own wife, production designer Polly Platt, who first spotted Shepherd's photograph on the cover of a magazine while the couple was out shopping together, and suggested she would be perfect for a role in her husband's upcoming film, The Last Picture Show. Platt could not have known just how consequential that suggestion would turn out to be, or that she was, in effect, personally introducing her husband to the woman who would soon end their marriage of nearly a decade. Bogdanovich cast the 21-year-old Shepherd in the film, and during production, the two began an affair right under the nose of Platt, who was working alongside them on the same set as the film's production designer, a role that placed her in close daily proximity to both her husband and the woman he was falling for throughout the entire shoot. Platt later described the pain of essentially having to witness the affair unfold in real time, working closely with the very woman who was involved with her husband. Recalling moments on set when she would style Shepherd's hair for a scene while privately consumed with jealousy and heartbreak over what was happening between her and her own husband just feet away. Bogdanovich and Platt divorced in 1971, with Platt pregnant with their second daughter at the time the marriage finally came apart. Though he and Shepherd never married, the two remained together for 7 years, working on several more films together, including Daisy Miller and At Long Last Love, before finally splitting in 1978. The affair effectively ended Bogdanovich's marriage to a woman widely credited as one of his most important creative collaborators, someone who had helped shape some of his most celebrated early work, including the original idea to adapt The Last Picture Show into a film in the first place. Their divorce marked a clear turning point in Bogdanovich's career as well, one that some critics and biographers have suggested he never fully recovered from creatively, noting that his work in the years following their split never quite reached the same critical heights as the films he had made while the two were still creative partners. Platt herself went on to continue working as a production designer on several more of Bogdanovich's subsequent films despite their divorce, an arrangement that speaks to just how professionally intertwined their lives had become even after the personal relationship between them had completely fallen apart. The next celebrity on this list didn't just take a husband away from his wife. She kept him for over 2 decades, weathering scandal, addiction, and a paternity suit along the way. Number 7. Jerry Hall. In the mid-1970s, Texas-born model Jerry Hall was engaged to Roxy Music frontman Brian Ferry when she crossed paths with Rolling Stones singer Mick Jagger, who was, at the time, married to his wife, Bianca. The two couples actually met socially at first, with Jagger and Bianca hosting Hall and Ferry for dinner on more than one occasion. Evenings that Hall later described in her own memoir as increasingly charged with an obvious, undeniable tension between herself and Jagger, even as their respective partners sat at the same table. On one particular visit, Jagger reportedly chased Hall around a table in Ferry's own home in a playful attempt to steal a kiss, only to be caught and chased off by an unamused Ferry. But the attraction between Hall and Jagger became increasingly difficult to ignore, and by May of 1977, the two had begun seeing each other seriously without their respective partners, a date Hall later said she and Jagger continued celebrating as their own private anniversary for the following 2 decades, treating it as the true beginning of their relationship, regardless of how the public initially perceived it. Hall's engagement to Ferry ended within months, and roughly a year later, in 1978, Bianca Jagger filed for divorce from Mick, citing his infidelity as the reason for the split. She reportedly received a settlement of around £1 million, along with primary custody of their young daughter, Jade. Hall and Jagger continued their relationship for the following decade, eventually going through a wedding ceremony together in Bali in 1990, though that marriage was later declared legally invalid by a British court in 1999 due to questions about its legitimacy under both Indonesian and English law, a technicality that only became relevant after it emerged that Jagger had fathered a child with another woman during their marriage. Despite the drama surrounding its beginning, Hall and Jagger's relationship lasted more than 2 decades and produced 4 children together, making it, by a wide margin, one of the longest and most significant relationships of Jagger's famously eventful romantic life. Hall's own mother, when later confronted with accusations that her daughter had been a homewrecker, defended her publicly, insisting that despite what the scandal publications of the era suggested, her daughter was a good, decent person who had simply fallen genuinely in love with the wrong man at an inconvenient time. It's a reminder that even scandals born from very public betrayals can sometimes evolve into genuinely lasting partnerships, at least for a while. The next story on our list, though, involves one of Hollywood's most enduring on-screen and off-screen partnerships, and it began with a director walking away from his wife of nearly 2 decades. Number 6. Sondra Locke. In 1975, actress Sondra Locke was cast alongside Clint Eastwood in the film The Outlaw Josie Wales, and the two quickly developed a close working relationship that soon turned romantic. At the time, Eastwood was married to his wife, Maggie Johnson, with whom he had 2 children, and a marriage that had, by most accounts, already grown distant over the years, with the two reportedly living increasingly separate lives even while technically still together, a private arrangement that outside observers at the time knew almost nothing about. Locke, for her part, was also married to sculptor Gordon Anderson, though their relationship was widely reported to have been unconventional and largely platonic in its final years, a marriage of companionship more than romance by the time she met Eastwood, and one that Locke herself later described as more of a lifelong friendship than a traditional marital bond. As Locke and Eastwood's relationship deepened, Eastwood's marriage to Johnson finally ended, and Locke went on to become his primary creative and romantic partner for the following 13 years, appearing alongside him in a total of 6 films throughout the late 1970s and 1980s, including Every Which Way But Loose and Sudden Impact, projects that showcased her range across both comedy and drama. The two became one of the most recognizable creative pairings in the industry during this period, rivaling even the prolific on-screen partnership of Charles Bronson and Jill Ireland from earlier on this list. And for years, the public largely viewed them as one of Hollywood's more stable, long-term, unmarried couples. Their relationship, however, eventually ended in a deeply public and painful legal battle in the early 1990s, when Locke sued Eastwood after learning he had quietly arranged for her development deal at a major studio to be effectively non-functional following their breakup, providing her with an office and a modest budget while ensuring none of her proposed projects ever actually moved forward. The case generated headlines for years and left Locke's later career significantly diminished, a stark contrast to the glamorous, prolific partnership the two had once represented. And Locke later wrote her own memoir, detailing what she described as years of manipulation and control within the relationship. It stands as one of the more complicated endings on this list, a partnership born from one broken marriage that eventually ended in bitterness and legal warfare of its own, proof that even a 13-year creative and romantic partnership could ultimately collapse into one of Hollywood's messiest legal disputes of the era. Our next entry involves an actress who broke ground on television while also breaking up one of Hollywood's most talked-about marriages behind the scenes. Number 5. Diane Carroll. In 1959, actress Diane Carroll was cast alongside Sidney Poitier in the film adaptation of the musical Porgy and Bess, and the two began an affair almost immediately, despite the fact that both were married to other people at the time. Carroll was wed to record producer Monty Kaye, while Poitier had been married to his wife, Juanita Hardy, for nearly a decade, and the couple had 4 young daughters together, ranging in age from toddlers to young children during the years the affair unfolded. Poitier later described his attraction to Carroll as instant and undeniable, recalling decades later in an interview that he had barely spent a few days working alongside her before he understood there was something uniquely compelling about her presence on set. The affair between Carroll and Poitier continued for an extraordinary 9 years, carrying on even as both of their marriages officially remained intact for much of that time. And even as Carroll gave birth to her own daughter with Kaye in 1960, a year into her relationship with Poitier, a complication that made the ongoing secrecy surrounding the affair increasingly difficult to sustain as both of their public profiles continued to grow. Carroll eventually divorced her husband first, believing Poitier would soon follow and commit to her fully, going so far as to move into and furnish an apartment Poitier had purchased for the two of them to share. But Poitier hesitated for years afterward, citing his responsibility to his 4 daughters as the reason he couldn't bring himself to leave his marriage right away, leaving Carroll waiting in a kind of romantic limbo for years at a time. Poitier and Hardy finally divorced in 1965, but rather than immediately marrying Carroll as she had expected, Poitier told her he needed more time before entering another marriage, a decision that devastated Carroll and eventually led to the end of their relationship entirely a few years later, after Carroll began seeing other people, and Poitier reacted with visible anger and possessiveness despite his own repeated hesitations. Poitier later wrote candidly about the guilt he carried over the affair for years afterward, describing extensive therapy he underwent to work through the pain his choices had caused his first family, therapy he credited with helping him eventually become a more present and self-aware partner in his second marriage, one he later described as the most stable and fulfilling relationship of his entire life. Carroll, for her part, went on to break new ground on American television just a few years later, becoming the first black woman to star in her own network sitcom, a milestone that arrived not long after the most painful chapter of her personal life had finally come to a close, and one that cemented her legacy in television history well beyond the scandal that had once dominated her personal headlines. Remarkably, despite everything that happened between them, The two eventually rebuilt a genuine friendship in their later years, appearing together warmly at public events decades after their affair had first begun. A reconciliation both of them later described as one of the more meaningful relationships of their later lives. Our next celebrity's affair played out very publicly on a movie set in the Texas desert, and it ended two marriages at once. Number 4. Ali MacGraw. By 1972, Ali MacGraw had become one of the biggest stars in America thanks to her role in the massive hit Love Story, and she was married to powerful Paramount executive Robert Evans, with whom she had a young son named Josh. That same year, Evans encouraged McGraw to take a role opposite action star Steve McQueen in the crime thriller The Getaway, a decision he would later have serious reason to regret, given that it was Evans himself who effectively arranged for his wife and McQueen to spend months together on location, personally lobbying for her casting because he believed the pairing would make for a commercially explosive film. McQueen, who was already in the process of divorcing his wife of 15 years, actress Nyla Adams, and McGraw, began an intense affair during filming that neither of them made much effort to hide, with reports from the set describing the two as nearly inseparable from the moment production began in Texas, spending long hours together between takes in a way that quickly became obvious to nearly everyone else working on the film. The tabloids of the era compared the scandal directly to the famous affair between Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton a decade earlier, and by the end of 1972, McGraw had left Evans entirely. She and McQueen married the following year, in 1973, though their marriage came with strict conditions that McQueen insisted upon, including a prenuptial agreement and a request that McGraw largely step away from her acting career altogether, a demand that meant walking away from her position as one of the most in-demand actresses in the entire industry at the height of her fame. The marriage between McGraw and McQueen ultimately lasted 5 years before ending in divorce in 1978, with both partners later acknowledging years of infidelity and difficulty on both sides, including McGraw's own admission that she struggled significantly with alcohol during this period of her life. Despite everything, McGraw and Evans reportedly remained on remarkably good terms in the years that followed, with Evans later saying that of all 7 of his marriages, his years with McGraw meant the most to him. A striking statement, given the very public and painful way their marriage had originally ended. McGraw herself later reflected in her own memoir that she regretted how completely she had allowed her identity to dissolve into McQueen's demands during their marriage, describing the years she spent away from acting as a period she still struggled to fully make peace with decades later. Our next entry involves a woman whose new marriage generated one of the most famous protest songs of the entire decade, written by the wife she left behind. Number 3. Mia Farrow. In 1968, shortly after her own divorce from Frank Sinatra, a 23-year-old Mia Farrow began an affair with acclaimed composer and conductor Andre Previn, who was, at the time, married to songwriter Dory Previn, a talented lyricist in her own right, who had already been nominated for multiple Academy Awards for her film work. The two women had actually been close friends, and some accounts suggest all three spent time together socially before the affair between Farrow and Previn began, with Farrow reportedly even staying as a guest in the Previns' home during a period when Andre was working on a film score, making the eventual betrayal feel especially personal and painful for Dory, who had welcomed Farrow into her own household as a friend. When Farrow became pregnant with Previn's twins in 1969, the truth of the affair became impossible to hide any longer, forcing all three of them to confront publicly what had, until that point, been an increasingly obvious but still officially unacknowledged situation among their overlapping social circles. Dory Previn, who had already struggled for years with her own mental health, experienced a serious breakdown upon learning the full extent of what had happened. an episode severe enough that she required a period of inpatient psychiatric care to recover, reportedly triggered in part by a panic episode she suffered while sitting on an airplane preparing for takeoff. Andre's divorce from Dory was finalized in July of 1970, and he married Farrow just 2 months later, in September of that year, at a small ceremony in London not long after their twin sons were born. In the aftermath, Dory Previn channeled her heartbreak into her music, releasing a deeply personal song the following year that many listeners immediately understood to be about Farrow and the affair that had ended her marriage. A song that became one of the most talked about tracks of her career, precisely because of how directly it seemed to address the betrayal she had experienced. Farrow herself later acknowledged publicly that she understood the song was written about her, addressing it decades later in her own memoir. Farrow and Previn's own marriage lasted 9 years before ending in divorce in 1979, after which Farrow began her own complicated and eventually notorious relationship with filmmaker Woody Allen. Dory Previn, for her part, went on to rebuild her own career and personal life in the years following her breakdown, eventually finding what she described as a long and genuinely happy second marriage, a detail often overlooked in retellings of this particular scandal that tend to focus almost entirely on the more famous names involved. Our next entry involves arguably the most famous celebrity breakup of the entire decade, one that helped define an entire era of tabloid culture. Number 2. Yoko Ono. In 1966, avant-garde artist Yoko Ono met John Lennon at one of her own gallery exhibitions in London, though their relationship did not become romantic until a couple of years later, and by most accounts, their earliest interactions revolved entirely around Ono's conceptual art pieces and Lennon's genuine fascination with the unconventional world of experimental art she inhabited. At the time, Lennon was married to his first wife, Cynthia, with whom he had a young son, Julian, and the two had built a quiet, relatively private family life together, away from the more chaotic aspects of Lennon's Beatles fame, choosing to raise Julian largely outside the spotlight in the years before Ono entered the picture. By 1968, Lennon and Ono had grown extremely close, corresponding frequently and spending increasing amounts of time together while Cynthia was often away, including during a trip to India that the couple had originally planned to take together as part of a larger group study retreat. A trip that ended up marking one of the final extended periods the Lennons spent functioning as a genuine married couple. Cynthia eventually returned home early from a trip abroad to find the two of them together at her own house, an experience she later described as the definitive end of her marriage, a moment of sudden and undeniable clarity after months of quietly wondering whether her suspicions about her husband's growing closeness with Ono were justified. Cynthia and John Lennon officially divorced later that same year, and Lennon and Ono married the following year, in 1969, quickly becoming one of the most scrutinized and, at times, publicly criticized couples in the entire music industry, with the press following their every public appearance in the years that followed. Ono was often unfairly blamed by fans and the press for the eventual breakup of the Beatles as a band, a narrative that persisted for decades, even though the group's internal tensions had been building for years before Ono ever entered the picture, driven far more by business disputes, creative differences, and the exhausting pressures of global fame than by any single outside relationship. Cynthia Lennon later wrote candidly about the pain of that period in her own memoirs, describing the particular difficulty of losing her marriage so publicly, while an entire generation of fans seemed to blame the other woman rather than her own husband for the choices he had made. Lennon and Ono remained married until his death in 1980, and despite decades of public scrutiny and criticism directed at her, Ono has continued to defend their relationship and its artistic partnership for the rest of her life, describing the bond between them as one built on genuine creative and personal partnership, rather than the simple scandal the public often reduced it to. It remains one of the most famous and most publicly debated relationships to ever emerge from this era, one that continues to generate discussion and reassessment even decades later, with more recent retrospectives increasingly pushing back against the unfair blame Ono absorbed for years, re-examining her own artistic career and legacy on its own terms, rather than solely through the lens of her marriage to one of the most famous musicians in history. But even this legendary scandal doesn't quite match the sheer scale of our number one entry, a woman who didn't just steal one husband during this era, she stole two. Number 1. Elizabeth Taylor. No celebrity on this list generated more headlines, more public outrage, or more genuine heartbreak than Elizabeth Taylor, who found herself at the center of not one but two of the most explosive husband-stealing scandals of the 20th century. Scandals that together helped cement her reputation as both one of the most talented and most controversial actresses of her generation. The first began in 1958, when Taylor's close friend, singer Eddie Fisher, was married to actress Debbie Reynolds, one of the most beloved and wholesome stars in Hollywood, a woman whose wedding to Fisher just a few years earlier had itself been treated as something close to a fairy tale by the American public, complete with adoring magazine spreads and a genuine sense of national investment in their happiness. Following the sudden death of Taylor's own husband, producer Mike Todd, in a plane crash that same year, Fisher reportedly grew close to Taylor while attempting to comfort her through her grief, spending increasing amounts of time at her side in the weeks and months following the tragedy, time that Reynolds initially viewed as simple compassion between old friends before slowly coming to understand it as something else entirely. That closeness quickly turned romantic, and by 1959, Fisher had divorced Reynolds and married Taylor instead, transforming Taylor almost overnight from a sympathetic widow into one of the most publicly vilified women in America. Magazines ran polls asking readers whether Taylor deserved to be considered a fit mother, and picketers reportedly gathered outside theaters, showing her films in protest, holding signs condemning her personal conduct in language that seems almost unimaginable by today's standards of celebrity coverage, given how normalized celebrity divorce and remarriage would eventually become in the decades that followed. Reynolds, for her part, maintained enormous public sympathy throughout the ordeal, cultivating an image as the wronged, wholesome wife left behind, and the scandal followed Taylor for years afterward, shaping public perception of her long after the marriage to Fisher itself had run its course and eventually ended in its own divorce. A divorce that, notably, generated far less public outrage than the one that had preceded it. Remarkably, Taylor would go on to repeat almost exactly the same pattern just a few years later, under even more dramatic circumstances. In 1962, while filming the enormously expensive epic Cleopatra in Rome, Taylor began an affair with her co-star, Richard Burton, who was, at the time, married to his wife of over a decade, Sybil Burton, and the father of two young daughters. The affair became so public and so overwhelming that it earned its own nickname in the press at the time, referred to simply as Le Scandale, and it generated more newspaper coverage than almost any other celebrity relationship of the entire decade, with reporters camped outside the film's set for weeks trying to capture photographs of the two together, and the production itself becoming so notorious that its runaway costs and constant scandal coverage nearly bankrupted the studio behind it. Even the Vatican reportedly issued a public statement criticizing Taylor's conduct, describing her behavior in harsh moral terms, an almost unprecedented level of institutional disapproval for a Hollywood affair, and one that only added further fuel to the already enormous media frenzy surrounding the production. Burton and Sybil divorced in 1963, and Taylor and Burton married the following year, in 1964, beginning one of the most famous, tempestuous, and heavily publicized marriages in entertainment history, one filled with legendary fights, lavish gifts, and a level of celebrity spectacle rarely seen before or since. Including a series of enormous diamonds Burton gifted Taylor throughout their years together, that themselves became the subject of ongoing tabloid fascination and were later auctioned for staggering sums decades after the marriage itself had ended. The marriage would itself end in divorce in 1974, followed by a brief and unlikely remarriage the following year, before finally ending for good in 1976, closing out one of the most dramatic on-again, off-again romances of the entire era, one that biographers still frequently cite as one of the defining celebrity love stories of the 20th century, regardless of how it ultimately concluded. Across both scandals, separated by roughly 4 years, Taylor became something like the defining symbol of this entire era, the single celebrity name most immediately associated with the phrase husband stealer, a reputation that followed her for the rest of her extraordinary life, even as she went on to become one of the most respected and beloved actresses of her generation in the decades that followed, eventually using her enormous fame later in life to become one of the earliest and most effective celebrity advocates for HIV and AIDS research and awareness. A legacy that, for many younger fans discovering her today, has come to define her public image far more than the scandals that once dominated the headlines of her youth. Looking back across all 10 of these stories, what stands out most isn't simply the scandal or the tabloid headlines that followed each one, but just how differently these relationships eventually turned out. Some, like Suzanne Summers and Alan Hamill, or Jerry Hall and Mick Jagger, evolved into genuine, lasting partnerships that outlasted the controversy of their beginnings, proving that even a relationship born from betrayal could, in certain cases, grow into something with real staying power. Others, like Sondra Locke and Clint Eastwood, ended in bitterness and legal battles that overshadowed everything that came before, leaving both parties with reputations forever complicated by how things ultimately fell apart between them. And for the wives left behind, women like Cynthia Lennon, Dory Previn, Niall Adams, and Debbie Reynolds, the public sympathy they received rarely made the private pain of those years any easier to carry. Each of them was forced to rebuild a life and, in several cases, a career under the weight of enormous public attention, watching as the women who had been involved with their husbands often went on to become even more famous in the years that followed. It's worth remembering that behind every one of these tabloid headlines was a real family quietly absorbing the fallout, children navigating divorced households, and two women whose lives had become permanently and publicly intertwined by circumstances neither of them had fully chosen. Several of these wronged wives, including Reynolds and Cynthia Lennon, went on to build substantial and successful careers of their own in the years that followed, refusing to let the scandal define the entirety of their public identities, even as interviewers for decades afterward continued asking them to revisit the same painful chapter of their lives again and again. Decades later, these stories remain some of the most talked about scandals in entertainment history, not simply because of who was involved, but because of what they revealed about fame, desire, and the very public cost of falling in love with the wrong person at the wrong time. Even now, biographers and documentary filmmakers continue revisiting these relationships, often finding new layers of nuance and complexity that the original tabloid coverage of the era never had the patience or the interest to explore, reframing several of these women, particularly Ono and Carol, in far more sympathetic and complicated terms than the simplistic villain narratives that dominated coverage at the time. What began as scandalous headlines designed to sell magazines has, in many cases, evolved into something closer to genuine historical curiosity. a chance to look back at an era when the private lives of famous people were treated as public property, and to ask what these stories still have to say about love, loyalty, and fame more than half a century later. In the end, perhaps the most enduring lesson across all 10 of these stories is simply how universally human they remain, stripped of their fame and their headlines. They're really just stories about people falling in love at inconvenient times, and about the very different paths those choices ended up carving through the rest of their lives. What once played out as scandal on the front pages of magazines now reads, decades later, as something closer to a shared human experience, one that transcends the fame and fortune of everyone involved, reminding us that even the most glamorous and seemingly untouchable people are ultimately governed by the same messy, complicated, and occasionally reckless impulses of the heart as everyone else. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.